Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into one of the strangest, most self-congratulatory chapters of human history. The Victorian Age, an era where men wore 10 layers of wool to prove their morality, women fainted recreationally, and science was used to justify literally everything, including racism. Yes, tonight we're diving into the bizarre, overconfident world of 19th century racial science, where gentlemen in waistcoats measured skulls with calipers, took notes in cursive, and called it progress. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let's get cozy. Maybe pour yourself some tea, preferably not from a jar labeled arsenic tonic. Let's think about this for a second. How did a bunch of bearded men in frock coats convince an entire empire that they were biologically superior because their foreheads were slightly less sloped? Who decided skull measurements equaled destiny? Did anyone ever stop mid-experiment and say, "Wait, this seems wildly unethical"? What did these people eat while casually inventing pseudoscience? And most importantly, how on earth did anyone get a PhD for comparing noses with a ruler? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1859, right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the British Empire, and the absolute peak of bad ideas delivered with unearned confidence. You're wearing too much clothing, your air smells faintly of coal and self-importance, and someone nearby is probably trying to prove your worth with a chart. Welcome to Victorian science. You wake up surrounded by men who all look like variations of Charles Dickens, thick beards, thick accents, and even thicker opinions. The Victorian gentleman scientist is not a professional. He's a hobbyist with a microscope and too much inherited money. Science isn't about discovery. It's about finding evidence that already agrees with your ego. Let's set the scene. It's breakfast time in a mahogany, panelled study, and you, dear listener, are draped in wool, seated at a long table next to a collection of men named things like Horace, Algernon, or inevitably, Reginald. Every one of them is sporting facial hair that looks like it was designed to scare away small children and food stains alike. Conversation moves in great, booming waves, occasionally interrupted by the sound of a teacup being set down with the kind of confidence only someone with an estate and no job can muster. It's a golden age of self-certainty. Victorians adore order. They order their books by height, their dinner by season, and their facts by how well they flatter British superiority. Science, in this room, isn't a profession. It's an afternoon diversion, tucked between fox hunting and explaining to the maid why she shouldn't whistle. If you have a microscope, a Latin dictionary, and a surplus of leisure, congratulations. You too can call yourself a scientist. Here, ideas are like sideburns. Big, unruly, and absolutely unchallenged. Someone proposes that people with smaller skulls are naturally less intelligent, and everyone nods along, as if this is as obvious as rain in Manchester. Dissent is not on the menu, unless you count a passing disagreement over the ideal length of a mutton chop. For the modern listener, it's a bit like sitting in a meeting where no one actually knows what they're talking about, but everyone has already agreed that whatever comes out of their mouth is groundbreaking. Let's talk about the equipment. In the Victorian lab, which is really just a drawing room with extra fumes, science is performed using beautiful brass instruments and the world's worst methodologies. Your fellow natural philosophers are measuring skulls, cataloguing insects, and pinning butterflies with all the accuracy of someone playing darts after 3 glasses of sherry. The results don't matter as much as the ritual. If the experiment happens in a room full of cigar smoke and Latin inscriptions, it must be correct. The real purpose of all this activity? Status. A Victorian gentleman scientist is nothing if not competitive. His greatest fear is not being wrong, but being outdone by Lord Bumblesnuff's latest monograph on the reproductive habits of the lesser spotted newt. New scientific societies spring up like weeds, each with a fancier name than the last. The Royal Society for the Measurement of Slightly Different Rocks, the Institute of Improbable Observations, the Guild of Men Who Like to Say Empirical. Each group has a crest, a newsletter, and at least one member who is legally required to be named Percival. Here's the twist. For all their bluster, these men are terrified of change, of the unknown, and most of all, of being average. The empire is growing, cities are swelling, and suddenly the world seems less certain than it did in 1815. So, what do? You measure things, you categorize, you invent scientific hierarchies that put you at the top, and everyone else somewhere below your butler. Science becomes comfort food for the anxious, a way to keep the chaos of modernity at bay. One beaker and badly drawn racial chart at a time. Sometimes you get a glimpse of real curiosity, a wild glint in the eye as someone pokes at a beetle or debates the shape of a flower. But it never lasts. The need to maintain Victorian orderliness smothers actual discovery. After all, you wouldn't want science to be unpredictable. That's what the lower classes are for. So you sit in your fortress of beards and bad ideas, sipping tepid tea, watching the parade of pipe smoke and prejudice drift by. The real marvel isn't the science, it's the sheer confidence with which nonsense is delivered. Here, in the empire of beards and bad ideas, you're not so much discovering the world as rearranging it to fit your own fuzzy reflection. And, like every Victorian experiment, the main outcome is an overwhelming sense of self-approval, plus a faint aroma of mutton and mothballs. Welcome to science, 19th century style. Proof that with enough leisure, a well-oiled beard, and a comfortable chair, you can convince yourself of almost anything. Let's talk about phrenology, a word that sounds impressive right up until you realize it's the scientific equivalent of palm reading for people who collect walking sticks. In Victorian Britain, phrenology was all the rage. The premise that the shape of your skull, the bumps and valleys and questionable lumps on your head revealed the secrets of your personality, intellect, and even your criminal tendencies. Imagine getting invited to a fancy dinner party, only to have some mustachioed gentleman announce, "Your occipital protuberance suggests you're prone to dishonesty." Pass the potatoes, Reginald. You didn't need an advanced degree to become a phrenologist. All you needed was a caliper, an impressive set of sideburns, and the audacity to fondle a stranger's scalp in public. Phrenology parlors popped up across Europe and America, offering head readings for the price of a pint. It was marketed as cutting-edge science, an accessible alternative to all those stuffy, complicated disciplines like medicine or, actual psychology. Instead of Freud, you got Frank, and Frank was convinced your bumpy cranium could reveal why you keep stealing your neighbor's turnips. The process was almost comically theatrical. First, you'd sit in a high-backed chair under a gas lamp, while the phrenologist, usually named something like Professor Grimblethorpe, would run his fingers slowly over your skull, occasionally pausing to make hem and ah noises. He'd consult a colourful chart, possibly framed in gold, that mapped your head into regions with names like amativeness, combativeness, and secretiveness. It was like a bizarre board game where the winner gets a personality diagnosis and a new reason to distrust their forehead. The Victorians loved it. Phrenology was modern, rational, and, best of all, it gave people an excuse for absolutely everything. Late to work? Blame your deficient order. Bad at parties? Must be a shallow socialness node. Your dog chewed up the sofa? The phrenologist can pinpoint the lumpy canine cranium responsible. It was a diagnosis for every disappointment and a justification for every vice, wrapped up in pseudo-Latin and earnest conviction. Of course, there was a darker side. Phrenology didn't just promise self-knowledge. It promised society a blueprint for sorting people by intelligence, morality, and, inevitably, by race. The Victorians turned it into a tool for classifying types, arguing that criminality, genius, and even your potential as a butler could be determined by a quick head check. Naturally, this system just so happened to confirm every bias the examiner brought into the room. "I'm sorry, madam, but your husband's sloping brow proves he'll never amount to much. And as for your Irish maid, well, best not leave the silver unattended." Phrenology charts began appearing in courtrooms, hiring offices, and schools. Employers were advised to palpate the heads of prospective servants. Doctors diagnosed hereditary idiocy with a quick glance at a baby's skull. Some ambitious Victorians even selected spouses after a thorough head examination, presumably leading to generations of couples staring gloomily at each other's parietal bones over cold mutton. And because Victorians loved a gadget, they invented the phrenology machine, a helmet bristling with levers and dials, promising a full cranial reading in under 5 minutes. It was like a steampunk hairdryer with a side hustle in stereotyping. No matter how silly it seemed, people lined up to have their organs of destructiveness measured, convinced this was the scientific future. Meanwhile, critics, there were a few, pointed out that the only thing phrenology truly revealed was the examiner's prejudice. But in the empire of beards and bad ideas, a lack of evidence was just evidence you weren't looking hard enough. The beauty of phrenology, for the Victorians, was that it made their world feel predictable. Each lump, each groove, each poorly washed sideburn could be slotted neatly into a chart. It didn't matter that it was nonsense. It mattered that it soothed the fear that maybe, just maybe, life was more complicated than a well-measured skull. So as you relax, drifting off to the gentle sound of gas lamps hissing and charlatans lecturing in rented halls, remember, somewhere a Victorian is being told his benevolence bump is undersized, his veneration lobe is overdeveloped, and he should never, ever attempt algebra. And the crowd applauds, reassured that the universe is as orderly as their favorite phrenology chart. Sleep tight, and keep your head covered, just in case someone tries to measure it while you dream. It's time to meet the Victorians at their most committed. Craniometry, the art of measuring skulls with such zeal you'd think they were searching for hidden treasure instead of excuses. Here's how your day begins. You're ushered into a chilly, echoing lecture hall where the only things stiffer than the collars are the attitudes. The air smells like chalk dust, old books, and a dash of formaldehyde. At the front stands a man with the kind of mustache that requires daily grooming and self-regard, holding a set of gleaming calipers. The crowd waits, rapt. After all, it's not every day you watch science attempt to quantify human worth with a ruler. Craniometry was the Victorian hobby that merged grave robbing with geometry. Its central premise was straightforward and horrifying. Take a person's skull, measure it obsessively, length, width, height, angle, volume, any dimension will do. Record your findings in a leather-bound notebook. And, crucially, interpret those numbers however best fits your theory. This process was considered so scientific that a collection of skulls could make you a celebrated expert. All you needed was a tape measure, a lack of shame, and a willingness to label strangers inferior because their heads were shaped differently from yours. Let's not sugarcoat it. Craniometry was grave robbing with paperwork. Victorian scientists fanned out across colonies and battlefields, gathering skulls from indigenous graves, battle sites, and anywhere a head might turn up. These were then boxed up and shipped back to London or Paris, where they'd be measured and compared, preferably by a man named Archibald, who had never left the comfort of his study. Imagine the scene: tea being poured, charts unfurled, and a polite debate about whether someone from the colonies could ever really appreciate Shakespeare. In the hands of the Victorians, craniometry became a kind of competitive sport. Who could collect the most skulls? Who could invent the most categories? Who could make the most outlandish claims about the superiority of their own group? Whole careers blossomed around the enterprise. The grandest names of Victorian anthropology, Broca, Morton, and their bearded brethren, filled books with meticulous diagrams showing that, shockingly, the measurements always put their own countrymen on top. Would you look at that, Jenkins? The British cranium is yet again revealed as the pinnacle of evolution. More scones? No measurement was too obscure. They compared cranial capacity, the angle of the forehead, the prognathism of jaws, even the size and shape of the eye sockets. If it could be quantified, it was catalogued. If it couldn't, well, that never stopped a determined Victorian. Outliers weren't seen as a reason to question the system. They were simply dismissed as anomalies, or more likely, as proof that someone wasn't quite fully human. With a few quick measurements and a lot of creative statistics, a person's entire value could be reduced to a number and a label, carefully penned in beautiful copperplate handwriting. But don't imagine all this happened in sterile laboratories. No. Most of these experiments took place in drawing rooms, universities, or over after-dinner port, surrounded by walls lined with portraits of ancestors who looked ready to leap from their frames and measure you themselves. There was ceremony to it. A display of calipers, a reverent silence. And then the numbers, spoken with the kind of solemnity usually reserved for ancient prophecy or bad poetry readings. Perhaps the most astonishing part is how earnestly everyone took it. Craniometry wasn't fringe science. It was mainstream, cited by statesmen, used in courtrooms, and even taught in schools. Policymakers looked to these skull studies for justification of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. The numbers, suspiciously tidy, comfortingly precise, offered moral cover for the empire's worst behavior. After all, if a chart said it, who were they to argue? By the turn of the 20th century, the cracks started to show. Real scientists began to notice that skull measurements changed based on things like nutrition, environment, and, shockingly, who was doing the measuring. But by then, the damage was done. Museums were full of labeled skulls, and the myth of measured supremacy had been woven into textbooks and policy. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, remember, sometimes the only thing bigger than a Victorian's beard was his ability to convince himself that a set of calipers held all the answers. Science, it turns out, is only as noble as the people wielding the ruler. You'd think that the Victorians, with their talent for inventing rules and charting noses, would be delighted when Charles Darwin strolled in with his big ideas about evolution. Instead, what unfolded was the greatest game of telephone in scientific history. Poor Darwin. He just wanted to explain why finches on the Galapagos had different beaks. Instead, he wound up as the reluctant poster child for the worst science class you've ever attended, where everyone's cheating off the wrong answer. Let's be clear, Darwin's real theory was revolutionary, but it was also subtle, messy, and most importantly, uncomfortable. He argued that all living things share common ancestors, and that survival is a messy business of adaptation, not destiny. No room for aristocratic cheekbones or civilized skulls at the top of nature's ladder, just a tangle of branches, dead ends, and accidental winners. In short, it's nature's version of your family tree, if your relatives occasionally turned into lemurs and nobody liked to talk about it at Christmas. But the Victorians were not here for complexity. They wanted hierarchies, preferably ones with themselves on top, preferably measured with brass calipers and T-brakes. So they took Darwin's tangled web and straightened it out into a pyramid, with civilized Europeans beaming smugly from the summit. Evolution, they decided, wasn't a process. It was a competition. And guess who just happened to be winning? Suddenly, every drawing room and schoolroom echoed with the phrase, "survival of the fittest," a slogan Darwin never actually used in his original text, but which spread faster than a cold at a Victorian orphanage. The term, coined by Herbert Spencer, was adopted by those eager to believe that nature itself endorsed their power, privilege, and tendency to wear uncomfortable shoes. If you wanted proof that empire, aristocracy, and class division were natural, well, there it was, straight from the beak of a Galapagos finch, delivered via the Queen's English. Even the idea of fitness was warped. In Darwin's writing, fitness meant simply the ability to survive and reproduce in your environment. In Victorian society, it became a loaded word, meaning money, manners, pallor, and the right kind of forehead. Suddenly, less evolved peoples were declared obstacles to progress, not just by force of empire, but by the laws of nature itself. The Victorians invented social Darwinism, an entirely new branch of nonsense, used to justify everything from child labor to colonial violence. Not only was it unethical, it was bad biology too. And imagine Darwin's position, awkward, to say the least. Here's a man who spent decades obsessing over barnacles and pigeons, suddenly finding his name invoked in parliamentary debates about whether or not to oppress half the planet. Darwin himself was a gentle soul, painfully aware of the cruelty people could inflict when armed with scientific authority. In his letters, he worried about how his ideas might be twisted. He agonized over publishing, fearing, correctly, that his theory would be used as a weapon by men who cared more for their own standing than for any actual truth. Still, once the genie was out of the bottle, there was no putting it back. Evolution became a buzzword for progress, destiny, and, above all, British superiority. Missionaries, bureaucrats, and mustachioed uncles the world over used Darwin's name as a kind of passport to self-importance. If anyone questioned them, they'd simply point to the chart. Look, see, it's science. Never mind that the chart was a work of fiction, and the fit species were always conveniently similar to whoever was holding the pen. Meanwhile, the darker applications multiplied. Social policies sprang up that claimed to improve the human race. Eugenics, forced sterilization, the whole 9 yards of bad ideas, all traced back, in the public mind, to one nervous naturalist and his boatload of beetles. The original message, a warning about nature's randomness and adaptability, was buried under a heap of smug justifications. So as you drift off tonight, spare a thought for poor Charles Darwin, forever haunted by images of earnest Victorians misquoting him at dinner parties. In the end, his theory was less a marching order and more a reminder that we are all, stubbornly, part of the same tangled story, misinterpretations, mistakes, and all. Let's take you into the heart of the Victorian scientific process. The laboratory, or, as it more often appeared, the drawing room masquerading as a laboratory. The real work of science took place not in pristine halls lined with test tubes, but in overstuffed studies, parlor rooms reeking of tobacco, and repurposed attics where the main safety equipment was a decanter of whiskey. Welcome to the laboratory of the Victorian gentleman scientist, where discovery, eccentricity, and a complete disregard for peer review collide. You open your eyes to shelves cluttered with glass jars, pickled frogs, half-dissected songbirds, and the occasional mummified hand, sharing space with cigar boxes and the remnants of someone's lunch. There's a distinct smell, a combination of candle wax, spilled gin, and the melancholy odor of decaying specimens. Your host, a man in an ink-stained waistcoat, welcomes you by offering a seat dangerously close to a stack of moldy papers labeled "Important Findings, Do Not Disturb, Mother." The equipment is a glorious mix of the useful and the useless. On the table, an imposing microscope, more polished than functional, a magnifying glass with a cracked handle, and a brass balance scale that hasn't measured anything accurately since Waterloo. There's a set of calipers, of course, no Victorian science complete without them, and a pile of quills, all perpetually out of ink. You might even spot a taxidermied owl, posed in the corner as a silent witness to the shenanigans. The work itself is creative. Gentlemen scientists, who rarely had formal training or any concept of double-blind studies, approached the mysteries of nature with the reckless energy of someone solving a crossword puzzle after 4 glasses of port. One afternoon might be spent measuring skulls for racial differences. The next, attempting to revive frogs with electricity, followed by lengthy debates about whether oysters feel regret. Every theory is proposed with the gravity of a royal decree, regardless of whether it's been tested, observed, or simply imagined between sips of sherry. This is not to say these men lacked enthusiasm. On the contrary, the Victorian laboratory was powered by the boundless confidence of men who had never been told no in their lives. Their belief in progress was so absolute that even a failed experiment became an exciting preliminary result. You could light your sleeve on fire while distilling tonics, or accidentally poison the dog with a miscalculated chemistry demonstration, and still be lauded for your adventurous spirit at the next club meeting. Of course, these amateur labs were social spaces as much as scientific ones. The real discoveries usually happened after hours, as the whiskey flowed and stories grew wilder. If someone's beetle collection escaped and infested the curtains, or if a jar labeled rat spleens burst unexpectedly, the result was not panic, but a good anecdote for the next issue of the Society newsletter. In Victorian science, disaster and discovery were cousins, both equally likely to earn you a reputation and possibly a commemorative plaque. The laboratory was also a stage for hierarchy and rivalry. A true gentleman scientist was nothing without an audience, preferably a gathering of equally bearded peers, and, ideally, at least one wide-eyed apprentice to jot down every eureka. Whether discovering a new species of moss or inventing a theory about the inheritance of melancholy, what mattered most was the performance. If you could speak with enough confidence, the room would nod along, even as the cat knocked over your crucial evidence. Unfortunately, the line between research and entertainment was perilously thin. More than one hypothesis started as a joke and ended up published in a reputable journal. Friends dared each other to concoct wilder and wilder ideas, from theories of brain lumps predicting destiny to the possibility of transmitting genius by wearing a powdered wig soaked in foxglove tea. As long as you published it in the proceedings, no one dared question your methods, unless, of course, you got gin on the manuscript. So, as you settle into sleep, picture yourself in the haze of cigar smoke, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in amber whiskey, and the comforting certainty that here, in the gentleman's laboratory, the only real limit to science is your own imagination and the size of your sideburns. Let's ring the bell for another day at a Victorian school, where the curriculum is less about curiosity and more about certainty. The wrong kind. You find yourself seated at a hard wooden desk, feet dangling above the cold floor, sunlight streaming through grime-streaked windows, and on the wall, a giant illustrated chart of the races of man. Welcome to the classroom, where scientific racism is not just tolerated, it's required reading. Textbooks in Victorian Britain weren't shy about their intentions. From the first page, you're greeted by illustrations ranking humanity from savage to civilized. Each section comes with a hand-drawn portrait. The noble European, standing tall and well-dressed, and the Negroid, Mongoloid, and Australoid, terms and images that would make modern readers shudder, each drawn with cartoonish exaggeration and labeled with scientific observations. The message is unmistakable. Hierarchy isn't just a social construct, it's science, or so they say. The teacher, likely a man with chalk on his cuffs and an impressive moustache, begins the day's lesson with a pointer in one hand and a battered copy of Types of Mankind in the other. Today's topic: why civilization favors us. He taps the chart with the gravity of a priest delivering a sermon. To question this lesson is to question the natural order. You, as a diligent Victorian student, are meant to accept these theories as fact, memorizing them along with your Latin declensions and the dates of famous naval victories. In this classroom, the language of science becomes the language of prejudice. Students are drilled on cranial indices and facial angles, asked to recite which races supposedly have the highest or lowest capacities for intelligence and morality. The measurements are presented with numbers and graphs, reassuringly objective to a child just learning multiplication tables. By the time you're 10, you can sketch a skull profile, label its parts, and explain why someone who looks different can't possibly be as advanced. You don't question where these ideas come from or why the data always seems to favor your own side of the playground. The curriculum seeps into every subject. Geography lessons aren't just about rivers and mountains, they're about civilized and uncivilized lands. Literature celebrates the virtues of the white man's burden. Even physical education carries its own dose of bias. The instructor lectures on the athletic superiority or moral discipline of certain groups, quoting scientific authorities as if reading from scripture. Science isn't teaching you how to think, it's teaching you what to believe. Outside the classroom, the impact is even more insidious. Parents repeat what they hear, newspapers publish findings, and the entire society starts to view difference as destiny. When a new student arrives, perhaps the child of an overseas official or someone whose features don't fit the dominant mold, they're instantly measured, categorized, and either quietly pitied or openly excluded. The schoolyard becomes an early proving ground for scientific racism, with children parroting terms they don't understand, but wield with frightening certainty. For those not at the top of the chart, school is a daily humiliation. Students from colonized backgrounds are forced to study textbooks that reduce their ancestors to case studies in primitive behavior. Class discussions on progress and civilization leave no room for voices outside the Victorian worldview. Some children learn to keep their heads down, others learn to resist quietly, finding ways to question or subvert the lessons without getting sent to the headmaster's office. Even as some teachers and students begin to question the orthodoxy, the system is stubborn. Exams require the right answers, never the right questions. Science, meant to illuminate, becomes a fog that hides truth behind numbers and drawings. The classroom, which should open doors, instead builds walls. So, as you close your imaginary exercise book and listen to the final bell ring, remember, sometimes the most dangerous ideas are the ones you learn before you know how to doubt them. In the Victorian classroom, scientific racism isn't just a subject. It's the air you breathe, the ink in your copybook, and the shadow on every test. Sleep well, and be grateful that tonight your education can be rewritten and your mind is your own. Let's stroll through the crisp morning air of Victorian London. You're wearing a top hat, carrying an umbrella for the fog, and, for the first time, you've got a ticket to the city's latest attraction, the human zoo. This isn't a metaphor, and it isn't hidden away. It's a public spectacle, right next to the lions and giraffes, and, shockingly, the queue stretches around the block. You shuffle forward with the crowd, heart beating with the strange mix of curiosity and discomfort that the Victorians seemed to mistake for progress. Behind iron bars or in recreated native villages, people from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands are exhibited just like animals. There are placards with their names, places of origin, and crucially, a list of their supposed racial characteristics, helpfully provided by the same scientists who spent their evenings polishing calipers and perfecting their theories of natural hierarchy. Children press their noses to the glass. Adults take notes for their journals, and everyone feels reassured that the world is just as the textbooks say, neatly divided and easily understood. There's a strange comfort in the display. "Look," says a bespectacled man to his daughter, "you can see the entire empire right here." The implication is clear. Difference is something to be gawked at, not understood, explained away, not embraced. The exhibits themselves are anything but passive. The people forced to perform in these zoos do their best to preserve dignity. Some sing or dance traditional songs, others cook or craft as they would at home. Sometimes they are given scripts, told to act primitive for the benefit of the crowd. Every gesture is scrutinized, every smile or frown noted by amateur anthropologists with notebooks and pencils poised. The scientific observers talk about bone structure and tribal customs as if discussing rare birds, never once pausing to ask about hopes, dreams, or stories. And if you think this is just an English phenomenon, think again. Human zoos pop up in Paris, Hamburg, New York, and even as far as Tokyo. They're international events, part of world's fairs and expositions. Millions of visitors pass through, gawking at authentic native life. Queen Victoria herself visits. Schoolteachers organize field trips. Newspapers publish glowing reviews. This is not a fringe attraction. It is mainstream, respectable, and cloaked in the language of education. The science that underpins all this is, of course, nonsense. Researchers with impressive beards and unshakable self-regard publish essays on racial hierarchy based on who eats what for breakfast and how long they can stand barefoot on cold grass. Measurements are taken, photographs are snapped. Skulls, height, and skin color are compared, charted, and used to reinforce what polite society already believes: that some people are destined to be seen, not heard, to be measured, not understood. Meanwhile, the exhibits endure daily humiliation. Their every move is watched, discussed, and misinterpreted. Some fall ill or suffer mental breakdowns, far from home and family. Others find small ways to resist, secretly mocking their captors, quietly preserving their language and dignity in private moments. Occasionally, they capture the sympathy of a visitor, or their story leaks to the press. But mostly, they remain silent objects in the eyes of science and empire. What's perhaps most chilling is how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary. After a few visits, the shock wears off. People discuss the human zoo over tea, alongside gossip about the weather and the latest scandal. Children grow up believing that it's normal to put people on display. Teachers and scientists assure everyone that it's for the sake of knowledge and progress. No one wants to ask the hard questions, because the answers are uncomfortable. So, as you close the gates of this strange, unsettling menagerie behind you, take a moment to wonder what you've really learned. Maybe, just maybe, the greatest curiosity is not in the people behind the bars, but in the minds of those who built the cage and called it science. Sleep well, and let's hope the walls between us become easier to take down than they were to build. It's the late 1800s, and you're now an honorary member of the Victorian Anthropological Society, a club whose founding principle is that the world is best understood from a well-upholstered armchair in London. Anthropology, for the Victorians, isn't just about learning from other cultures. No, It's about collecting stories, bones, and artifacts to support the grand narrative that the British Empire is the center of everything, and everyone else is somewhere along a sliding scale of almost British to not even trying. Picture yourself at a society meeting, surrounded by mahogany and cigar smoke, where men named Percival, Augustus, and Lady Euphemia discuss native customs over tea and scones. There's always a map on the wall, recently updated, because some poor island has just been renamed after a cousin of the Queen. On the table are trinkets, spears, ceremonial masks, and mysterious objects collected from every corner of the empire. Each one is a conversation starter, a souvenir, and, most importantly, a piece of evidence in the argument that Britain is the pinnacle of civilization. The language of the discipline is clinical, cold, and always slightly smug. Reports are written not for the people being described, but for other armchair explorers, emphasizing difference, strangeness, and the need for intervention. Anthropologists in the field are less scientists and more imperial agents. They're sent out with pith helmets and sketchbooks, tasked with cataloguing not just plants and animals, but entire peoples, measuring foreheads, counting teeth, and making endless notes about rituals they barely understand. If something seems odd or confusing, that's all the more proof of backwardness. Why do these villagers worship rivers? Asks one society member, while stirring his tea with imported sugar and pouring from a pot made in India. The science of anthropology is rarely neutral. Every observation, every drawing, and every skull measured is another brick in the wall of empire. When a custom doesn't fit with Victorian morals, it's labeled barbaric. When a belief system doesn't match Anglican Christianity, it's superstition. If people organize their society differently, it's a primitive form destined to be replaced by the civilizing hand of British governance. The less a practice resembles Sunday lunch in Surrey, the lower it's ranked on the scale of development. And, of course, all of this is wrapped in the velvet glove of help. The Victorians love to say they're uplifting the world, building railroads, founding schools, and improving legal systems, all while extracting resources and erasing cultures. Anthropology becomes an imperial PR campaign. Tribal leaders are renamed chiefs or kings and given medals at parades, while actual power is quietly centralized in colonial offices. Local languages are recorded, but only so they can be properly translated into English. Even art and music are documented in order to prove the simplicity of colonized people, never their genius or complexity. Meanwhile, British museums swell with loot. The grand halls of the British Museum become shrines to empire, full of artifacts acquired, borrowed, or simply taken during fieldwork. Glass cases are labeled with the name of the collector, not the creator. A visitor can stroll from Africa to Asia in an afternoon, marveling at primitive art and exotic masks, never once stopping to consider the violence behind the display. The official story is progress, but behind the scenes, it's a story of loss, of languages, histories, and knowledge systems erased to make room for Victorian certainty. For many, anthropology is a game of status and spectacle. Those who bring back the rarest object, the most shocking story, win a round of applause and a published essay. But for the people being studied, it's something else entirely. A slow, steady displacement, being told you're interesting, but never important, unique, but always inferior. So as you settle in for the night, surrounded by the sound of crackling fireplaces and the echo of distant lands described in third person, remember, anthropology, in the Victorian era, wasn't about understanding the world. It was about collecting it and making sure that the story always ended with the British on top. Sleep well, and let's hope your dreams are full of questions, not just answers. It's time to eavesdrop on one of the strangest dinner debates the Victorian era ever served: polygenism. Tonight's guest list features men with mutton chop whiskers and monocles, gathered around a walnut table, eagerly carving up both roast pheasant and the human family tree. Because in the mid-19th century, serious scientists entertained a theory so wild that it makes phrenology look like Sudoku. The idea that different races were actually different species, created separately, with separate destinies, and, of course, very separate places in the pecking order. Pelagianism was the science of division, built for a world that wanted excuses. The basic argument went something like this: if you look different, you must come from different stock, never mind migration, climate, or the minor detail that everyone's human. Polygenists insisted that the white European was not just at the top of the ladder but standing on a completely different one. Africans, Asians, indigenous peoples, each belonged to their own original creation. So the theory went, which conveniently explained why some people got to rule and others were destined to serve. This was not just a barroom fantasy. Polygenism was endorsed in lectures, published in scientific journals, and quoted in courtrooms. It was presented as fact by men in frock coats who spent their days collecting skulls and their evenings congratulating each other. The great proof was found in bones and measurements, arm lengths, jaw lines, even the shape of an ear. If you squinted just right and ignored all the evidence to the contrary, you could convince yourself that these differences weren't just skin deep, they were fundamental, biological, and unchangeable. The stakes were enormous. Polygenism wasn't just a quirky theory, it was political dynamite. In the age of abolition, as Britain and other countries struggled with the legacy of slavery, polygenists became the comfortable allies of plantation owners and colonial officials everywhere. If races were different species, then calls for equality could be dismissed as sentimental nonsense. Human rights? Those were for your own kind. Empathy? Strictly optional. Even religion, which in other eras had argued for the unity of humanity, was cleverly twisted. Some polygynists cherry-picked verses to prove that the Bible supported their divides. Others simply claimed that Genesis never mentioned everyone. Opposing them were the monogenists, scientists, theologians, and sometimes even a few progressive politicians who argued, against the flow, that all humans shared a single origin. It was a debate not just of science, but of morals. Monogenists pointed out that, genetically and anatomically, humans were far more alike than different. But in the Victorian public mind, where difference sold books and confirmed prejudices, polygenism always drew a bigger crowd. Let's not imagine that these debates were polite. Polygynist tracts were written with a confidence only possible when you've never questioned your own reflection. They published elaborate charts showing the lineages of the world, always with Europe at the top, and the rest trickling down in increasingly exaggerated fashion. Theories grew wilder, that different races had different ancestors, that some couldn't feel pain the same way, that, given the choice, nature always picked the British. The dinner table was full of bravado, but in the real world, these ideas became laws, immigration policies, and even justifications for violence. The tragedy, of course, was how thoroughly this thinking seeped into everything. Pelagianism influenced anthropology, medicine, and even the design of world's fairs. It painted difference as destiny and made prejudice seem like common sense. And the more elaborate the theories, the more impossible it became to question them, especially if you were sitting on the wrong side of the table. Eventually, as genetics and common sense began to prevail, polygenism was debunked and discarded, relegated to the attic of terrible ideas. But by then, its damage was done. Generations had grown up with the idea that division was natural, inevitable, and even scientific. So, As you drift off tonight, spare a thought for those who resisted, the voices that insisted on unity, even as the experts drew lines. The next time someone claims division is destiny, remember, sometimes the only thing separating us is the story we choose to tell, and history is full of stories just waiting to be rewritten. Welcome to the hallowed halls of the Victorian Museum, where the air is thick with dust, reverence, and the faint scent of mothballs. It's the age of empire, and museums are booming. Cathedrals not for faith, but for knowledge, where every exhibit is a silent tribute to the reach and the plunder of British science. You walk beneath high stone arches, the floor echoing with your footsteps, and realize that nearly everything on display has traveled further than most Victorians would ever dream. These aren't just collections, they are trophies. Each glass case is filled with artifacts, bones, weapons, jewelry, and of course, human remains. Skulls and femurs are labeled with neat copper plate, specimen, South Pacific, or collected, Sudan, 1879, Sir Archibald. Rare manuscripts are stacked beside shrunken heads, and pottery sits near ceremonial masks, each one wrenched from its home and repurposed for the curious gaze of Londoners who never have to wonder how it got here. For the Victorian public, the museum is a time machine, a safari, and a victory parade, all under one roof. The narrative is always the same. The empire collects, categorizes, and preserves what others can only create. Each artifact, from an Egyptian mummy to a Maori cloak, is stripped of its story and slotted into a grand tale of progress, with Britain, naturally, as the final chapter. Even the placement of objects is a lesson. In the center, the wonders of the classical world, admired and civilized. Around the edges, the primitive artifacts, a world tour of the less advanced. The unspoken message is as heavy as the stone sarcophagus by the entrance. All roads lead to London. Behind the scenes, the process is as colonial as the collections themselves. British officers, missionaries, and explorers send crates of loot back from every outpost, encouraged by scientific societies hungry for new specimens. There are instructions for what to bring: skulls, skeletons, tools, anything that can be measured, catalogued, and compared. The more unusual, the better. Sometimes, entire families are uprooted for anthropological study. Local resistance is rarely mentioned on the exhibit placard. And then there's the science. Curators and visiting scholars examine, classify, and pronounce their judgments, drawing elaborate connections between the objects and their pet theories of race, progress, and civilization. A skull becomes proof of inferiority. A mask becomes evidence of arrested development. Pottery is displayed as a window onto vanished cultures, even if the makers are still very much alive, just not allowed to visit their own heritage. The museum doesn't just display objects, it displays power. For visitors, the effect is mesmerizing. Crowds marvel at the scale and exoticism of the exhibits, their ideas about the world confirmed and expanded. Children press their faces to the glass, learning that the world is full of wonders, and that Britain's role is to collect and curate them. School groups march through, notebooks in hand, sketching artifacts and reciting the official narratives. There's awe, yes, but also an unsettling pride, a sense of ownership over the world's diversity, rebranded as one nation's legacy. Yet not everyone is fooled. Some visitors, especially those from colonized lands, see only theft. The museum is not a sanctuary but a crime scene, its glass cases filled with evidence of loss and erasure. A few bold critics, writers, artists, and even some early anthropologists begin to question the morality of the collections. Where are the stories of how these objects were taken? Who decides what is worthy of display? Who gets to write the labels? And who is never mentioned? By the end of the Victorian era, museums have become shrines to a particular kind of science, one that values possession over understanding, display over dialogue. The knowledge on offer is impressive but incomplete, and the silence in the halls is often the silence of those who were never allowed to speak. So as you wander out past marble lions and heavy doors, take one last look back. The world on display is remarkable, but it's only half the story. And someday, maybe, the other half, the voices and histories behind the glass, will finally be heard. Until then, the museum dreams in silence, waiting for the day when all its stories are told. Settle in for another Victorian afternoon, where the air is thick with the aroma of black tea, tonic water, and the underlying musk of something less palatable, Victorian masculinity dressed up in science. In this world, drawing rooms are both battleground and laboratory. And the measure of a man is not just his sideburns or waistcoat, but his ability to debate the fitness of entire populations without ever getting biscuit crumbs on his vest. Here's the scene. The men of science gather after a hearty luncheon, bellies full and egos fuller, each with a steaming cup of tea in one hand and a glass of invigorating tonic in the other. The tonic, more gin than quinine, promises health, energy, and the vague sense of superiority that comes from sipping your medicine in a cut crystal tumbler. They toast to progress, empire, and the white man's burden, all with the smooth confidence of men who have never been told to lower their voices. As conversation warms up, so does the rhetoric. Today's topic: who counts as truly civilized, and who is merely decorative background for the empire's grand adventure. The talk swirls between colonial governance, the inferiority of tropical races, and the importance of maintaining strong Anglo-Saxon stock. Someone, inevitably, will quote Darwin out of context. Another will reference a recent skull measurement or the stamina of British soldiers in India. Nobody will mention the actual people being measured or governed. Science, in this room, is less about inquiry and more about justifying what everyone already wants to believe. The Victorians, for all their obsession with manners, loved drawing hard lines between real men and everyone else. Masculinity, here, is defined by dominance of nature, of women, of colonized peoples, and, most importantly, of the self. To be a gentleman is to be rational, unemotional, and firm in opinion, preferably while wearing 3 layers of tweed in July. A man who doubts or hesitates is accused of weakness, or worse, sentimentality. Words spoken with the same horror reserved for a spotted apple or a French novel. This version of manhood is enforced with scientific authority. Medical journals warn that too much introspection or emotional expression can lead to nervous disorders. Anthropologists insist that lesser races are naturally more emotional, more childlike, and thus unfit for leadership. Even the advertising of the day promises tonics and pills that will restore manly vigor. A clear message that strength is something you can buy, provided you have the right prescription and an iron constitution. But the pressure isn't just on outsiders. Victorian men themselves live under constant scrutiny. Every action, from the firmness of a handshake to the depth of a baritone, is weighed against the imaginary standard of the perfect British male. The language of science provides both a carrot and a stick. Follow the rules, and you are advanced, rational, and destined to lead. Slip up, and you risk sliding down the evolutionary ladder, joining the ranks of the overly emotional, the savage, or the, heaven forbid, effeminate. Boys are taught from a young age to suppress tears, control impulses, and never, ever admit to fear. The classroom, the sports field, and the home are all training grounds for this brand of masculinity. Meanwhile, women are kept at the periphery of these debates, invited to pour the tea but rarely join the conversation. When they are discussed, it's through the same scientific lens that sorts skulls and classifies continents. Women, it is said, are naturally less rational, more susceptible to hysteria, and in constant need of male protection or correction. The message is clear. In the empire of science, men rule, and everyone else is a case study. Yet beneath the surface, anxiety simmers. The very need to prove manliness, again and again, hints at its fragility. For all the bravado, Victorian masculinity is a performance, a carefully rehearsed script with no room for mistakes. As the tea grows cold and the tonic bottles empty, what remains is the memory of a conversation where science did less to illuminate and more to reinforce the boundaries of a world built on exclusion. So, as you close your eyes tonight, let the taste of tea and tonic fade. Remember that not all experiments seek truth. Some just try to keep the old stories alive, no matter the cost. And perhaps the bravest thing a Victorian could have done was to question what it really meant to be strong. Wake up in the heart of Victorian Britain, and you'll quickly notice who's missing from the grand parade of scientific progress. Women. The bearded men get the busts, the medals, and the footnotes. The women? They get the footstools, the housework, and an endless stream of patronizing advice. If you're a woman in science, your greatest challenge isn't the lack of a microscope. It's the fact that society would rather you used it to clean smudges off the windows. You might be clever, curious, and full of questions. But Victorian Britain greets female intellect with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. The official story is that women's brains are too small, their nerves too fragile, and their natural purpose too obvious to waste time on manly things like chemistry or botany. If a woman shows scientific promise, doctors are summoned to explain that too much thinking will cause her uterus to wander around her body. A diagnosis so common, it has its own name: hysteria. The prescription? Bed rest, embroidery, and absolutely no scientific societies. But here's the subversive truth. Women were everywhere in Victorian science, if you knew where to look. Some of the most important discoveries were quietly made in drawing rooms, conservatories, and garden sheds. Their origins attributed to fathers, brothers, or husbands. Women collected, pressed, and catalogued thousands of new plant species. They bred insects, charted the movements of stars, kept meticulous records of weather patterns, and even conducted experiments, just not the kind that got you a statue in Westminster Abbey. Take Mary Anning, fossil hunter extraordinaire. She discovered some of the most important dinosaur remains of the 19th century, only to watch men in top hats present her findings at scientific conferences. Sometimes without so much as a thank you. Ada Lovelace, the first computer programmer, wrote algorithms that wouldn't be recognized as such for over a century. Her male peers called her the enchantress of numbers, which sounds romantic until you realize it's Victorian code for brilliant. But let's not admit it. Caroline Herschel discovered comets, mapped the stars, and won a gold medal from the Royal Astronomical Society, then had to make her brother's breakfast every morning. Even in the home, science flourished. Women grew gardens that doubled as laboratories, breeding rare orchids and inventing new rose hybrids. They published anonymously or under initials, or simply saw their work incorporated into larger projects led by men. If you wanted to share an observation on animal behavior, you'd send a letter to a journal, sign it CW, and hope no one guessed you wore a corset. Scientific societies debated whether to admit women as members. Most said no, citing natural law and the dangers of intellectual overexertion. The few who relented, like the Botanical Society of London, were radical outliers. And even then, women had to enter by a side door. At the same time, the public image of women in science was carefully managed. The press praised lady naturalists as long as their discoveries were decorative, new flowers, pretty shells, or unusual birds. But heaven help the woman who published a theory about evolution or questioned the natural order. She'd be accused of moral corruption, or worse, of unsexing herself. The fear wasn't just that women might learn too much, it was that they might prove the men wrong. Still, women persisted, adapting, subverting, and supporting each other. They formed their own networks, shared correspondence, and sometimes quietly mocked the men who dismissed them. Behind every great man of science, there was often a wife, sister, or daughter whose contributions went unrecorded, whose questions shaped the answers, and whose patience propped up an entire field. So as you drift off tonight, picture the invisible geniuses of Victorian Britain, kneeling in muddy fields, peering through makeshift telescopes, scribbling in the margins of borrowed books. They didn't get the credit, but they moved the world just the same. And if you dream of science tonight, remember, it belongs to everyone, no matter who writes their name on the front page. Let's open the ledger and step into the Victorian mind, where everything, absolutely everything, must be sorted, labelled, and filed. You're in a world powered by catalogues, lists, and endless charts, where even leisure activities come with taxonomies. The Victorian era's true legacy isn't steam engines or empire. It's the ironclad belief that the universe is just one well-organized index card away from being tamed. In this world, there's no such thing as miscellaneous. Victorians classify plants, animals, rocks, and, most perilously, people. Scientists spend their days pinning butterflies to boards, then ranking them according to an ever-evolving system of types. The Royal Society for the Naming of Beetles, yes, this was a real obsession, meets weekly to argue whether a new variety of ladybug is a subspecies, a mere colour morph, or something so profound it deserves its own genus and an after-dinner speech. Classification goes beyond nature. It infects every aspect of daily life. Crime? There's a taxonomy for that. An entire criminal anthropology springs up, led by men convinced they can identify thieves, murderers, and pickpockets by the angle of their jaw or the curve of their ear. Libraries aren't places to browse. They are battlegrounds for cataloguers. Dewey Decimal wasn't British, but the spirit of obsessive order certainly was. Even the British class system is a sort of social taxonomy. Duke, Earl, Merchant, Scullery Maid, each slotting neatly into their rung on the great societal ladder. And then comes the human body. The Victorians were positively giddy at the prospect of classifying physical features. There are endless debates about the best way to measure foreheads, noses, and lips, each metric supposedly unlocking secrets of intelligence, temperament, and moral worth. The entire pseudoscience of physiognomy is reborn, promising to reveal a person's character from the shape of their brow or the tilt of their chin. It's like astrology for men, with rulers and way too much free time. The danger is obvious, but easy to ignore when your name is Reginald and your own category happens to be the one writing the rules. Once people are divided by types, race, class, criminality, even personality, it becomes alarmingly easy to justify mistreatment, exclusion, and oppression. The numbers on the chart aren't just idle scribbles, they're ammunition for prejudice. A whole genre of scientific literature springs up, illustrated with painstakingly detailed diagrams, each one more eager than the last to rank humanity from best to worst. At the same time, the Victorians' love for lists borders on the poetic. Gentlemen naturalists swap catalogues of ferns the way modern kids trade game cards. Households keep inventories of linens, cutlery, and, for the very organized, their children's misdemeanors. Newspapers run top 10 lists, though in 1875, these are less about pop songs and more about the most common causes of indigestion amongst the urban working class, the world becomes a massive ledger book, one that never quite balances. And yet, beneath all the charts and categories, there's a kind of anxious hope. The Victorians are surrounded by chaos, a rapidly changing world, an expanding empire, and the relentless march of new ideas. Classification is their way of imposing order, of pretending that if everything can be named, it can also be controlled. If a new animal turns up in the Amazon, you write it down and assign it a Latin name. If a new social problem arises in Manchester, you devise a list of types most likely to be involved. But as the century wears on, cracks begin to appear. The lists grow too long, the categories too blurred. People stubbornly refuse to fit into neat boxes. Real science starts to reveal how superficial and even dangerous these classifications really are. The urge to control is slowly replaced by the realization that complexity is not chaos, and not everything that matters can be measured. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine the rustle of index cards, the scratch of pen on paper, and the quiet rebellion of every messy, glorious thing that refuses to fit the Victorian system. The universe, it turns out, is much bigger and much stranger than anyone's list, and sometimes the best things can't be catalogued at all. It's a foggy London morning, and you're clutching your notebook, ready to witness the Victorian era's favourite scientific scavenger hunt, the search for the missing link. This wasn't just a casual research project. It was a national obsession. Victorians wanted proof, tangible and ideally fossilized, that they were perched on the highest branch of the evolutionary tree, just a stone's throw from angels and several clever leaps ahead of everyone else. It all started, as so many Victorian ideas did, with Darwin. His theory of evolution sent the era's thinkers into a tailspin. If humans came from earlier forms of life, surely there must be a link bridging the gap between primitive apes and refined Victorians. The race was on to find this transitional figure, a creature conveniently close enough to prove the science, but distant enough to leave everyone's sense of superiority intact. Museums, newspapers, and drawing rooms buzzed with anticipation. Expeditions fanned out from Britain, equipped with pith helmets, shovels, and a relentless determination to dig up the past. Any suspiciously large tooth or oddly shaped bone was greeted with wild excitement and given a Latin name within the week. The press turned each find into headline news: half man, half beast, discovered in Java, regardless of whether the evidence amounted to a single molar or a suspiciously old potato. The missing link was more than just a fossil hunt. It was a chance to bolster all the Victorians' favourite beliefs. If you could prove a neat progression from ape to Englishman, you could also prove, by implication, that some living humans were closer to the ape end of the spectrum. Theories about race, class, and national destiny were all drawn into the fossil frenzy. In schools and public lectures, charts appeared showing imagined evolutionary lines, each helpfully ending in a white, mustachioed gentleman holding a teacup. But the hunt kept running into one stubborn problem: reality. Evolution doesn't work in straight lines. Fossils are rare, bones are fragile, and nature has never cared about making life easy for Victorian taxonomists. Every time a jawbone turned up in a cave, there was a fierce debate. Was it a new species? Was it a diseased person? Was it, as one embarrassed curator whispered, just a regular skull that someone's dog had chewed on? When the so-called Piltdown Man was unearthed, a sensational missing link found in an English gravel pit, scientists and the public swooned. It fit every expectation perfectly until, decades later, it was revealed as an elaborate hoax, a combination of human skull and orangutan jaw glued together by a prankster with a wicked sense of irony. Meanwhile, real discoveries were happening, quietly and without fanfare. Far from the London spotlight, fossils in Africa and Asia began to reveal a much more complicated picture of human ancestry, one with many branches, dead ends, and messy crossovers. But these didn't make for tidy museum displays or reassuring headlines. Victorians preferred their evolutionary story with a clear protagonist, themselves, and a series of supporting characters fading conveniently into extinction. All the while, the missing link became a metaphor for everything the Victorians feared about their own place in the world. What if they weren't the inevitable outcome of history? What if progress wasn't a straight line? What if the universe was less a staircase and more a tangled hedge maze, full of surprises and reversals? By the early 20th century, the search for the missing link had mostly fizzled out, replaced by real paleontology and a growing sense of humility. The fossil record refused to deliver a single, perfect ancestor. Instead, it told a story of shared origins and branching possibilities, a family tree in which everyone is, at some level, related. So, as you tuck in tonight, let the echoes of pickaxes and Victorian debates fade away. Remember that life's greatest mysteries are rarely solved by simple answers or by gluing together the bits you want to see. The only real missing link was the one between the world as Victorians wished it, and the wild, interconnected reality they only began to glimpse. It's late in the Victorian era, and you're attending an exclusive garden party thrown by the Society for the Scientific Improvement of Humanity, otherwise known as the Let's Play God Club. The lemonade is tepid, the sandwiches are mostly cucumber, and the main topic of conversation is how best to rearrange the human gene pool as if it were a flower bed outside Buckingham Palace. Welcome to the unsettling world of eugenics, where the aristocracy and the rising class of scientific experts decide that evolution just isn't moving fast enough. So it's time to take matters into their own, very well-manicured hands. The theory behind eugenics is breathtakingly simple and equally breathtakingly arrogant. If you can selectively breed horses and hounds, why not people? Sir Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin and the spiritual father of this movement, argues that society should encourage the best stock to have more children and discourage the undesirables from reproducing at all. You sip your lemonade, wondering if you make the cut. Galton, meanwhile, is busily inventing questionnaires, charts, and even matchmaking services for the fit, as if organizing the world's most judgmental dating app. It all sounds rather polite and practical at first. Eugenics is sold as a way to uplift the race, to reduce crime and poverty, and to fill England with ever more clever, robust, and attractive citizens. The upper crust nods approvingly. This is exactly the sort of science they've been waiting for, one that requires them to do nothing but carry on as usual and claim the moral high ground while they're at it. Scientific papers are published, society columns are written, and before long, eugenics becomes as fashionable as afternoon tea. Soon, the language of good breeding invades every corner of Victorian life. Advertisements offer scientifically matched marriages. Charitable organizations offer advice, sometimes incentives, to the worthy poor, while quietly recommending institutionalization or sterilization for those deemed hopeless. Politicians jump on board, proposing legislation to monitor and control the breeding of citizens. Schools teach the principles of heredity and racial hygiene alongside mathematics and Latin. The line between science and social engineering grows thin, then invisible. But beneath the surface of this genteel project is a deep well of anxiety and control. Eugenics isn't just about producing more geniuses. It's about tidying up society's messy edges, eliminating the troublesome, the inconvenient, and, above all, the different. Improvement becomes an excuse for exclusion. The very same scientists who claim to measure intelligence and virtue with rulers and questionnaires also decide who is fit to belong and who is best left behind. And the criteria, conveniently, look suspiciously like the guest list at the garden party. Wealthy, white, able-bodied, and preferably educated at Eton. Critics do exist, of course, though their voices are drowned out by the enthusiasm of the crowd. A few worried doctors and clergy warn that eugenics is a dangerous perversion of science and ethics. Some even dare to suggest that human beings are a bit more complicated than racehorses. But their warnings are dismissed as sentimental, old-fashioned, or simply unscientific. After all, who would trust empathy over a perfectly drawn pedigree chart? As the Victorian era gives way to the 20th century, eugenics takes on a life of its own. The British version inspires movements in the United States, Germany, and beyond, mutating into programs that are far less genteel and infinitely more brutal. What began as the pet project of overconfident aristocrats and amateur scientists ends up justifying some of the darkest policies of the modern age. So, as the party winds down and the last sandwich dries out in the sun, remember, science, left unchecked, can turn from curiosity to cruelty with alarming speed. The road from afternoon matchmaking to state-sponsored sterilization is shorter than anyone at the garden party imagined. Sleep well, and let's hope the only thing you inherit tonight is the wisdom to question the next improvement that comes dressed in science's finest clothes. It's the height of the Victorian scientific age, and you're about to witness one of history's oddest obsessions, measuring the human face with the seriousness of a moon landing. You step into a candle-lit study, past shelves of skulls and the faint aroma of pipe smoke, where a man with a bushy mustache beckons you to sit. In his hand is a tape measure, a flimsy ribbon of cloth that, in this room, holds the supposed secret to civilization itself. Here, your worth is reduced to inches and millimeters. First, your head is measured from ear to ear. Then your nose, length, width, the angle at which it dares to protrude. Your jawline is scrutinized, your eye sockets compared to a set of brass calipers imported from France. The scientist takes notes with solemn gravity, convinced that somewhere among these numbers lies the truth about your character, intelligence, and most importantly, your proper place in the world order. This isn't just quirky Victorian behavior. These measurements form the backbone of a sprawling pseudoscience known as anthropometry, which promises to quantify what makes a person superior or inferior. The man wielding the tape measure isn't content with a single reading. No, he'll fill entire notebooks with your dimensions. And then, using an impressive amount of self-confidence and selective mathematics, he'll draw a series of bold conclusions. Unsurprisingly, those conclusions always favor the measurer and his friends. Charts are compiled, showing the average nostril width of Teutonic types versus Mediterranean stock. Foreheads are classified as noble or receding. There are endless debates about whose nose is the straightest, whose cranium the roundest, whose profile the most civilized. Scientists publish treatises loaded with diagrams and ratios, and soon the tape measure becomes as indispensable as the tea kettle in any self-respecting British household. The damage is done not only in the drawing rooms and universities, but in society itself. These charts and numbers make their way into courtrooms, job interviews, and immigration offices. People are sorted, accepted, or rejected on the basis of their measurements. A few unfortunate souls become statistics, their faces dissected in public lectures or printed as cautionary illustrations in textbooks. The idea that a ruler can reveal your value is both absurd and, for many, utterly devastating. And of course, there's an extra dose of irony. Many of these scientific authorities fudge their findings to support whatever hierarchy is most fashionable that week. If an unexpected result pops up, a civilized nose on the wrong person, it's quickly written off as an anomaly, a fluke, or the result of admixture. In other words, if the world doesn't fit the chart, it's the world's fault. But behind the pomp and precision, you can sense the anxiety. The Victorians live in a world that's changing faster than ever. Railways, revolutions, a globe that suddenly feels smaller and more complicated. The measuring tape is a comfort, a way to make sense of the unknown by reducing it to numbers and ratios. It's a defense mechanism wrapped in data and delivered with a straight face. As you rise from the measuring chair, brush the chalk from your shoulders and leave the study. Remember, the numbers say more about those who do the measuring than those who are measured. And sometimes, the longest distance in science is the space between the facts and the truth. So as you drift off, tonight, let the sound of rulers snapping shut fade away. Rest easy knowing that the measure of a person was never in the tape, but in the heart. A fact that no Victorian scientist, no matter how many calipers he owned, could ever quite grasp. It's another foggy morning, and you find yourself joining a troop of Victorian missionaries as they set out for the far reaches of the British Empire. Their trunks are stuffed with Bibles, barometers, and the occasional magnifying glass, because, in true Victorian fashion, spiritual salvation and scientific observation go hand in hand. The mission? To civilize, convert, and naturally collect. To be a missionary in the 19th century was to travel with a dual sense of purpose, save souls and gather specimens. You're told you're bringing light to darkest Africa, untamed islands, or the wilds of India, armed with scripture in one hand and the latest anthropological treatise in the other. The locals, the theory goes, are living reminders of what Europe used to be. Living proof, so says the guidebook, that civilization is a journey and the British have simply arrived first. The moment you step ashore, the work begins. Every ritual, custom, and story you encounter is carefully catalogued in a leather-bound notebook. Natives are studied with the same clinical interest as rare orchids. Their music is primitive, their stories quaint, their clothing curious. The missionaries' letters home are full of ethnographic detail, but it's all filtered through the lens of someone who already knows the ending. Conversion to Christianity, adoption of British manners, and, preferably, a fondness for tea. Victorian missionaries are convinced that their civilization is the only destination worth reaching. The ultimate compliment for a local convert is to become almost British, to take an English name, dress in starched linen, and sit politely through Sunday service. Lessons in hygiene and temperance are taught alongside hymns. Local languages are learned, but only as a stepping stone to replacing them. Progress is defined by how closely a village can mimic the customs of a Surrey parish. There's a relentless optimism to it all, an unshakable faith that everyone will be grateful for this makeover. If someone resists, it's interpreted as stubbornness, backwardness, or even proof of moral deficiency. Rarely does it occur to the missionaries that people might be perfectly content with their own beliefs, or that their ancient superstitions are as deeply meaningful as a Victorian Christmas carol. The most ambitious missionaries become amateur ethnographers, sketching temples, recording folk tales, and amassing collections of artifacts to ship back to British museums. The line between conversion and collection blurs. A wooden idol is not just a religious symbol, it's a specimen, destined for display alongside the minerals and beetles in a London glass case. Baptism certificates and skull measurements end up side by side in the same trunk, ready for analysis by the next meeting of the Anthropological Society. Yet, there are moments of real encounter, shared laughter, acts of kindness, glimpses of understanding. Some missionaries learn from their hosts, even as they try to teach. But these stories rarely make it into the official reports. The grand narrative remains. The empire is here to uplift, and anyone not clamoring for salvation must be waiting to be shown the way. Meanwhile, back home, these adventures are retold as parables of progress. Church basements fill with relics and stories, each one reinforcing the myth that civilization is a one-way street. Paved by Victorian values, little thought is given to what's lost along the way. The languages forgotten, the stories left untold, the worlds left misunderstood. So, as you settle in tonight, picture those distant missionaries, mapping and measuring, teaching and taking, certain of their place at the end of history's road. Let their certainty fade into the gentle truth. Civilization is not a finish line, but a garden full of many paths, each worth walking, each rooted in its own kind of wisdom. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of questions, not just answers. You've landed in a Victorian gallery, surrounded by heavy frames and even heavier opinions. Here, art isn't just about beauty. It's about classification, power, and the quiet assertion of who belongs at the center of the canvas. The paintings lining the walls are grand, the subjects posed and proper, always hinting that some faces are made for portraits and others for background scenery. The atmosphere is equal parts admiration and instruction. Look at these features, these clothes, this posture. This is civilization, and it can be measured in brushstrokes. But art alone isn't enough for the restless spirit of Victorian science. Enter photography, a new, intoxicating technology that promises to capture truth, freeze time, and, most importantly, provide evidence for the hierarchies everyone's already sure exist. Cameras become tools of empire and pseudoscience, whisked off to colonial outposts and anthropological expeditions. Photographers are instructed to document the exotic and the other. Subjects are lined up in profile and full face, made to stand next to rulers or blocks for scale, stripped of context and turned into data. The results are as chilling as they are clinical. Instead of lively images bursting with personality, you see rows of faces, expressionless, decontextualized, and, in the captions, categorized by race, tribe, or stage of evolution. In some of these photos, a local chief or healer is captured at their most vulnerable, their identity reduced to an exhibit, their story replaced by someone else's description. Meanwhile, back in London, these images are displayed in salons and study halls, analyzed in earnest by men in waistcoats who have never set foot outside their own county. Paintings and photographs alike are drafted into the cause of proving superiority. Portraits of wealthy Europeans are painted in luminous oils, their skin flawless, their settings plush with books, maps, and velvet drapes. When colonial subjects are painted, they appear at the margins, barefoot, unsmiling, painted in shadow or picturesque squalor, always a little less real, a little less important. Victorian artists, knowingly or not, become complicit in the building of visual hierarchies. Even the growing trend for ethnographic drawing, sketches of native types, is more about scientific display than human understanding. In the home, family photographs become badges of respectability, with each child posed in perfect order, every curl and collar fussed over. Owning a family album is both a mark of modernity and an assertion of social standing. To be photographed is to be acknowledged. To have your image catalogued is, paradoxically, to be stripped of your story. For those outside the favored categories, the camera is rarely kind. Meanwhile, the empire exports these images everywhere, on postcards, in travel books, in scientific atlases, at world's fairs. Visitors line up to view galleries of the colonized, comparing faces the way they compare curios in the next room. What's lost is the richness, the joy, the individuality of every subject. The world becomes a series of categories, sorted by lens and brush. And yet, even here, there are moments of resistance. Some artists quietly subvert the rules, painting with empathy, lingering over the details that suggest common humanity. A few photographers hand the camera to their subjects, capturing laughter or pride when no one else is watching. But these images rarely make it into the albums on display. The official record remains one of distance, order, and control. So, as you turn out the light tonight, remember, art and photography can reveal, but they can also conceal. They can capture beauty, or they can capture prejudice, dressed up in sepia tones and gilt frames. Sleep well and dream of a world where every portrait tells a whole story, and every camera is held by the hands of those who wish to be seen. The Victorian era, a golden age for sideburns, steam engines, and dubious medicine. Tonight, you're a patient, ushered into a doctor's wood-panelled surgery, greeted by the twin scents of carbolic acid and pipe smoke. The doctor himself is a vision of confidence, wielding a stethoscope, a degree from Cambridge, and the rock-solid belief that your health is determined by the color of your skin. This is an age when medical science, for all its advances, is entangled with social prejudice. Victorian doctors are obsessed with racial difference, and nowhere does this show more than in their theories about disease and pain. Textbooks confidently assert that certain races are naturally immune to, or tragically doomed by, specific illnesses. Ailments common among the poor and colonized are attributed to inferior constitutions, tropical blood, or primitive habits, as if your immune system knew to check your passport before letting in a virus. If you're Black, South Asian, Irish, or from any group outside the Anglo-Saxon ideal, you're likely to be seen as a case study for exotic illnesses. Medical journals fill with descriptions of Negroid fevers or Hindu melancholia. Catch malaria in India? Clearly, it's because your race is predisposed. Suffer cholera in London? That's just unfortunate filth. Unless, of course, you're poor, in which case it's proof you're not evolved enough to handle urban life. Victorian hospitals are divided, sometimes officially, sometimes quietly, by race, class, and even the shape of your nose. White patients are thought to experience more pain, so they get more anesthesia and gentler care. Everyone else? The myth is that primitive races have thicker skin, duller nerves, and can withstand surgical agony with barely a whimper. Surgery becomes a test of character as much as a treatment. The best you can hope for is a brisk bedside manner and a prayer that the doctor's science is having a good day. The fascination with bodily difference runs deeper still. Medical students dissect cadavers from workhouses and colonial outposts, racing to publish their findings. They measure bones, compare organs, and draw grand conclusions about who is biologically suited to rule, serve, or simply expire. For the unlucky, being ill is only the beginning. Being studied can mean losing your privacy, your dignity, and sometimes your remains to a London anatomy theatre. But it's not just about the body. Victorian psychiatry is a fever dream of wild theories, many of them weaponized to keep society neatly sorted. Drapetomania, the so-called mental illness said to afflict enslaved people who tried to escape captivity, is just one grim example. The concept of degeneracy is wielded as a catch-all diagnosis for poverty, rebellion, or simply being inconvenient. If you're not thriving in the Victorian world, the problem is never the world, it's you. There are glimmers of hope, of course. Some doctors quietly question the dogmas, noting that environment, poverty, and trauma play a bigger role in disease than ancestry. A few reformers argue for public sanitation, hospital access, and the radical notion that everyone, regardless of color, deserves to suffer less. But theirs are the quieter voices in a world obsessed with difference and order. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, take comfort in your access to modern medicine, a world of antibiotics, anesthesia, and doctors who, usually, don't ask about your skull shape before setting a broken arm. The Victorians taught us that medicine can heal, but also harm. Let their mistakes remind us. Real science listens to the body, not the biases in the doctor's mind. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of leeches, calipers, and anyone who uses science as an excuse for cruelty. Let's settle into a stiff-backed chair in a London parlour where the wallpaper is busy, the tea is strong, and the conversation is even stronger, especially if it involves the British Empire. Here, among the potted ferns and earnest gentlemen, morality is the latest tool in the kit of colonial ambition. The Victorians have already tried science, industry, and the measuring tape. Now they invoke ethics to justify their ever-expanding rule. At the center of this empire-building morality tale is the idea of uplifting the supposedly less fortunate peoples of the world. This is the famous white man's burden, not just a poem, but a rallying cry. The argument goes like this: Britain has a duty, a sacred obligation to bring law, order, and good manners to the world's benighted regions. In other words, conquest and control are just acts of kindness with extra paperwork. It's philanthropy by force, charity with bayonets. The parlour debates are full of phrases like civilizing mission and improvement. It's said that the people of Africa, India, and the Pacific are lucky to be governed by men who understand the finer points of cricket, parliamentary debate, and when to say please and thank you. Never mind that local traditions are older than Stonehenge, or that many uncivilized societies have their own rich systems of law, art, and philosophy. For the Victorians, progress looks like a London street, and morality is measured in teaspoons of sugar and miles of railway track. Missionaries and colonial officers write long letters home about their selfless toil, their efforts to abolish barbaric customs, and their plans for model schools and hospitals. But the help always comes with strings attached. Learn English, convert to Christianity, and abandon superstition. Whole generations of children are taught to recite Wordsworth, salute the Union Jack, and distrust their grandparents' wisdom. If they excel, they might be held up as proof of the system's success, a new class of civilized natives. If they resist, they are labeled stubborn, backward, or dangerous. Meanwhile, politicians cite moral duty in Parliament. News reports frame each imperial war as a crusade for justice, rarely mentioning the resources extracted, the uprisings crushed, or the treaties broken. At home, charity balls and church sermons raise money for missions and native welfare, providing an endless supply of warm fuzzies for the well-to-do. Even art and literature join the cause, painting empire as a noble, almost parental project. Queen Victoria herself becomes the mother of countless subjects she will never meet. But behind every moral justification lies an ugly truth. What's called uplift is often erasure, and what's named as help is often harm. Cultures are bulldozed, languages disappear, and spiritual traditions are mocked or banned outright. Rebellions are put down, often brutally, and resistance is always painted as ingratitude or savagery. The moral cloak covers a multitude of sins, making it easier to ignore the pain and injustice that follow in the empire's wake. Not everyone is fooled, even in their own time. Critics, Indian reformers, African intellectuals, Irish nationalists, and a handful of skeptical Brits write scathing essays, stage protests, and remind anyone who will listen that morality is not just what you say, but what you do. Their voices, though often drowned out, hint that another world is possible, one built on respect, not rescue. So, as you lie back tonight, consider the legacy of all those earnest parlor debates. Morality can inspire greatness, but it can also excuse cruelty. The real test is not how loudly you proclaim your virtue, but how gently you treat those who don't look, think, or live like you. Sleep well, and let the truth that kindness needs no empire, and justice needs no conquest, guide your dreams. Scientists started collecting body data like Poker Monday. Height, arm span, skull volume, anything measurable became moral evidence. It was pseudoscience wrapped in math and moustache wax. You're standing in a Victorian laboratory, stripped to your drawers, while a man with a clipboard and an unsettling twinkle in his eye measures your ear circumference. Behind him is a chalkboard covered in elaborate ratios, Latin words, and a very confident drawing of what he calls the ideal cranium. You'd like to leave, but unfortunately, you've already been declared a fine specimen, and he's only just started on your toe length. This is anthropometry, the 19th century art of measuring people to confirm whatever the scientist already believes. It's like horoscopes for racists, except instead of star signs, they're using calipers and really questionable charts. And much like horoscopes, it can sound scientific if you say it with enough authority and have sideburns large enough to store pens. The premise is this: the human body holds secrets, not just about biology, but about morality, intelligence, and cultural value. Measure enough foreheads, weigh enough skulls, and surely you'll uncover the cosmic spreadsheet of who's on top. Spoiler alert: it's always the people doing the measuring. Every dataset, every average, just so happens to support the existing racial and class hierarchies. How convenient. The measurements aren't limited to the head. Everything is fair game. Hip width, emotional temperament. Nose angle, criminal tendency. Arm length, possibly a reflection of one's musical ability, or perhaps their evolutionary proximity to apes, depending on the day and the funding. The goal isn't clarity, it's classification, preferably in a way that keeps the aristocracy comfortably on top and the colonized firmly at the bottom. And where are these numbers going? Into dusty volumes with titles like Observations on the Cranial Index of the Borneo Malay or the Nasal Bridge as a Predictor of Civic Loyalty. Into courtrooms, where they're used to argue who is inherently criminal. Into schools, where children are tracked based on how well their measurements match up to the ideal British child. Into immigration offices, where facial angles might determine whether you're suitable to enter the country. The obsession spreads like a rash. Colonial administrators in India, South Africa, and Australia are given rulers along with rifles. Entire ethnic groups are catalogued based on skull shape and shin length. Prisoners are measured before they're convicted. Soldiers are sorted by jawline. Even mental asylums get in on the action, with the belief that madness, too, can be measured in millimeters. The result is a sea of numbers masquerading as truth. Charts bloom with categories: Alpine, Mediterranean, Mongoloid, Negroid, Nordic, Celtic, Semitic, each with its own set of characteristics. Some are praised for noble features, others are condemned for deviant physiognomy. Never mind that most of the conclusions contradict each other. Never mind that the samples are skewed, the tools inconsistent, and the interpretations laughable. As long as it looks like science, it feels like truth. But here's the quiet, infuriating genius of it all. By turning bodies into data, the Victorians made prejudice look objective. No longer was racism just a matter of opinion. It was backed by evidence. And once it was in the textbooks, the museums, the policies, well, that made it real, tangible, hard to argue with, especially when the argument is a ruler and a man with tenure. Eventually, the cracks start to show. Real scientists begin questioning the methods, pointing out the biases, noting the absurdity of measuring someone's soul through their scapula. But the legacy lingers, quietly lurking in modern systems, subtly shaping how we think about bodies, beauty, intelligence. So tonight, as you stretch out under your warm blanket, unmeasured, unranked, unclassified, take comfort in the fact that you are more than the sum of your limbs. The Victorians tried to measure humanity into a hierarchy. They failed. And the only thing their calipers truly captured was their own insecurity. Sleep well and stay immeasurable. Imagine being invited to dinner and realizing everyone's using your book to justify racism. Darwin spent years politely trying to say, "That's not what I meant," while colleagues ranked skulls next to the soup tureen. You're seated at a long Victorian dining table, candles flickering, silverware gleaming, and conversation swirling like a slow-moving moral disaster. On one side, a bishop pontificates about divine hierarchy. On the other, a professor with a magnificent beard insists that evolution proves why the British are nature's favourite child. At the head of the table sits Charles Darwin, mild, thoughtful, and visibly regretting every sentence he's ever written. Darwin, poor man, never set out to ignite a cultural inferno. His theory of evolution was about adaptation and survival, not social status. He was fascinated by nature's tangled complexity, not by categorizing people. But the Victorians, ever hungry for justification, saw in On the Origin of Species the perfect user manual for empire. If animals evolved to dominate weaker species, then surely societies must work the same way. Colonialism wasn't cruelty, it was biology with better table manners. As the wine flows, someone inevitably raises a toast to natural selection, as though it's a dinner guest. They speak of the fittest and the unfit with the cheerfulness of people who assume they'll never be in the second category. They quote Darwin's words selectively, twisting them into moral certainties about who deserves to rule, who deserves to serve, and who should be politely erased. The laughter is genteel. The implications are monstrous. Darwin, ever the gentleman, tries to interject, softly, carefully, because nothing kills the mood like realizing your life's work has become a manifesto for bigotry. He explains that fitness doesn't mean moral worth, just the ability to survive and reproduce. He reminds them that evolution isn't a ladder with humanity at the top. It's a sprawling, chaotic web. But the guests smile indulgently, sip their claret, and carry on ranking skull sizes as if he's just complimented the soup. This twisting of Darwin's ideas becomes a national pastime. Social Darwinism takes off like wildfire, promoted by men like Herbert Spencer, who coins the phrase survival of the fittest. In Spencer's version, evolution justifies everything from child labor to economic inequality. If you're poor, it's because you're less evolved. If you're rich, it's because nature loves you. The factory owner becomes a lion on the savannah, and the working class? Antelope who should have evolved faster. Even eugenicists, the self-appointed gardeners of humanity, claim Darwin as their patron saint. Never mind that he explicitly rejected their conclusions. Never mind that he was appalled by the very notion of selective breeding in humans. His name becomes shorthand for every form of inequality that Victorians can dress up in Latin. It's as if his theory had been translated into a different language entirely. One where empathy got lost somewhere between the appetizers and the main course. Darwin spends his later years in increasing discomfort, watching as his nuanced ideas are stripped for parts and repurposed into propaganda. He writes letters to friends, expressing his unease. He distances himself from those who use his name to rank races and justify empire. He even reminds readers that compassion is one of humanity's greatest evolutionary strengths, a trait, he notes, that could one day help society overcome its darker instincts. But by then, the noise is too loud. The dinner party has moved on, too busy congratulating itself to hear the host. So as you lie in bed tonight, think of poor Darwin, forever stuck at that table, nodding politely while everyone misquotes him. Science, like dinner conversation, can be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. And history is full of people who mistook complexity for permission. Sleep well, and remember, the true measure of evolution isn't who climbs the ladder fastest. It's who remembers to lend a hand to those still finding their footing. The same society that invented scientific racism also believed tight corsets improved morality. If that doesn't tell you how logic worked in 1880, nothing will. You're laced into 5 layers of wool, linen, whalebone, and disapproval. Your lungs are negotiating with your ribs. Your stomach's been politely relocated somewhere near your throat. And yet, you are told this is peak refinement. In Victorian England, fashion isn't just about looking good. It's about showing your virtue, your class, and, apparently, your anatomical submission to social order. Corsets, bustles, starched collars, monocles, and absurd hats aren't just trends, they're tools. Tools for signaling that you are civilized, well-bred, and, most importantly, superior to the unfortunates who either can't afford to dress this way or, worse, don't want to. It's an era when how tightly you can cinch your waist is somehow connected to how pure your soul is. Because of course it is. Fashion becomes a language, a restrictive, itchy, breathless language that declares who belongs where in the social hierarchy. The well-dressed are clearly better people. The poor, whose clothes are practical, mismatched, or patched, are deemed morally suspect. If they were good and hard-working, the thinking goes, surely they'd have a hat with more feathers. And as with all things Victorian, the obsession with appearance isn't confined to Britain. The empire exports its fashion like it does its tea, in large quantities and with the quiet assumption that everyone else is doing it wrong. Colonized people are pressured, coerced, or outright forced to adopt British clothing styles. To be civilized means dressing like your colonizer, even if it means wearing wool suits in tropical heat or stockings in monsoon season. Traditional clothing is labeled costume or savage garb. Missionaries hand out bonnets with Bibles. Schools ban native dress in favor of uniforms. A man in a turban or a woman in a sari becomes a problem to be solved. But show up in trousers and a cravat? Suddenly, you're on your way to becoming a model native. Victorian thinkers even claim that different races are more or less inclined toward refined clothing. White skin, they argue, is naturally drawn to linen and lace, while darker skin is more comfortable in looser or simpler garments. These arguments are paraded around in fashion journals and pseudo-academic essays, as though cotton preference were genetically encoded. Meanwhile, back home, women are fainting in drawing rooms and calling it grace. Their corsets are cinched so tightly that organs are permanently displaced. But doctors still insist that these garments are not only harmless, they're helpful. A tightly laced waist supposedly restrains immoral urges, keeps women from overeating, and prevents hysterical outbursts. If you're thinking, that sounds like the cause of all three, you are correct. Men aren't spared either. Their suits are stiff, their collars strangling, and their shoes made of something that probably used to be a turtle. The goal is to look like a pillar of respectability, even if you can't bend your knees. Physical discomfort is reframed as moral discipline. If your spine is straight and your waist is waspish, then clearly your ethics are equally well tailored. It all becomes part of the same ridiculous logic. The British look civilized, therefore they are civilized. And, If someone doesn't look British, well, they must need civilizing. This is how clothing becomes ideology. A pair of gloves isn't just an accessory, it's a declaration of superiority. So tonight, as you lie there in a blissfully stretchy t-shirt with no whalebones in sight, remember, the Victorians built a world where fashion dictated virtue and virtue justified conquest. Sleep well, knowing your worth isn't determined by your waistband. You are perfectly respectable in your pajamas, no cravat required. By the early 20th century, genuine biologists started dismantling these racist frameworks. But by then, the damage was done. Entire policies, institutions, and attitudes were built on nonsense in lab coats. You're standing in the aftermath of a scientific parade that got wildly out of hand. The confetti is calipers. The floats are covered in skull charts, and the marching band is playing Ode to Phrenology in a key no one asked for. The Victorian obsession with ranking people by their bodies is finally starting to lose steam, but only after it's already made a complete mess of everything. Enter the new wave of biologists, anthropologists, and geneticists with actual data, actual experiments, and the audacity to say, hang on, none of this adds up. They point out the obvious. Intelligence isn't linked to skull shape. Moral worth can't be found in a nostril angle. And race isn't a biological category, it's a social one wearing a lab coat that's been dry cleaned by colonialism. The backlash begins with careful corrections in scientific journals. Researchers start to dismantle the so-called racial hierarchies that Victorian pseudoscientists had so confidently etched into textbooks. New studies emphasize variation within groups over difference between groups. The Human Genome Project doesn't exist yet, but even early 20th century biologists begin noticing that human genetics are far more fluid, complex, and overlapping than any neat racial taxonomy would allow. And yet, the bad ideas refused to die quietly. Victorian pseudoscience had been so successful not because it was smart, but because it was useful. It gave empires justification, politicians cover, and elites a sense of cosmic importance. And it had wormed its way into institutions like an idea-shaped termite infestation. Universities still taught outdated racial typologies. Museums continued to display skulls in racially segregated glass cases. Immigration laws across Europe and America used scientific claims to decide who was desirable and who wasn't. Eugenics programs, still gathering steam, framed forced sterilization and segregation as acts of public health. Even more insidious? These ideas had settled into culture. They shaped how people saw themselves, their neighbors, and entire continents. They justified unequal schools, biased hiring, and who got to sit at which lunch counter. In short, racism had gone fully academic. And once an idea is codified into law, policy, and polite conversation, it takes more than a peer-reviewed study to root it out. To make matters worse, some of the very institutions trying to undo the damage had helped cause it. Museums that now sought to return human remains to their rightful homes were the same ones that once bought those remains like collectibles. Universities that now published anti-racist research had once funded expeditions with measuring tape and measuring bias. The pivot was slow, awkward, and often full of caveats. Still, change trickled in. Thinkers like Franz Boas began teaching cultural relativism, arguing that societies should be understood on their own terms, not compared to an imaginary British gold standard. Biologists began focusing on genes and environment rather than race. Psychology shifted, slightly, away from skull measurements and toward behavior and experience. And Darwin, long dead, still misquoted. But his defenders kept trying. They argued, correctly, that evolution had nothing to do with conquest or colonization, and everything to do with change, complexity, and context. That cooperation, not domination, is often what drives survival. So as you drift off tonight, remember this: the truth has always had a slower start than nonsense, but it tends to outlast it. The fake science of superiority wore a fancy coat, spoke in Latin, and strutted like a peacock. But in the end, it couldn't survive the very scrutiny it claimed to represent. Sleep well, knowing that real science listens, corrects itself, and admits when it was wrong. And that history, however messy, always offers us a chance to do better, if we're willing to pay attention. And finally, to put the tape measure down, as the soot settles over Victorian London, you realize something. They weren't evil geniuses. They were terrified. Terrified of losing power, terrified of equality, and willing to dress fear in the clothes of reason. You're standing in the aftermath of an empire built on nerves. Nerves so taut they had to invent entire sciences just to justify themselves. Behind every rigid collar, every measured skull, every monologue on the lower races, was a panic attack in tweed. The Victorians weren't calm, intellectuals observing the world. They were people in denial about change, about morality, and most of all, about the fact that they might not be the heroes of the story. Because for all their inventions, their railroads, their steamships, and their monocled certainty, the Victorians lived in a moment of global shift. The world was getting louder, browner, freer, and harder to control. Empires were cracking, colonies were resisting, workers were organizing, and women were starting to demand votes and education and comfortable shoes. This made people in power deeply uncomfortable. And discomfort, when bottled up in waistcoats and authority, doesn't vanish. It mutates. It mutates into rules, into disciplines, into entire academic fields designed to ensure that the people currently at the top stay there forever, backed by the unbiased power of numbers and very long mustaches. That's the dirty secret of Victorian racism. It wasn't confidence, it was fear. The fear that they weren't actually better, just luckier. That the empire was built not on destiny, but on gunpowder and self-importance. And rather than confront that terrifying possibility, they made charts, they made graphs. They said, "Look, this child's cranium is smaller. Clearly he's unfit to govern." They dressed insecurity up as intelligence, and it worked for a while. The appearance of reason is a powerful drug. When you say something with enough authority, in a three-piece suit and a lecture hall, people stop questioning it, even if it's absurd, even if it's harmful, even if it involves measuring people's ears and declaring them semi-civilized. Logic was stretched like a corset, tight, painful, and still somehow considered fashionable. What's wild is how often they contradicted themselves. They said Africans were physically strong but intellectually weak, then turned around and said they were physically weak but emotionally volatile. They said the Irish were too wild to govern, and also too docile to rebel. Any piece of evidence, no matter how flimsy, could be twisted to fit the narrative, because the goal was never truth. The goal was control. And yet, among the nonsense, there were always voices whispering, "This isn't right." A journalist here, a reformer there, a student who asked too many questions, a colonized thinker who picked up the textbooks, saw through the contradictions, and wrote back. Resistance was never absent. It just didn't get tenure. So now, with the benefit of time and hindsight, and the glorious ability to breathe without a corset, we can see it clearly. The empire wasn't just powered by ships and soldiers. It was powered by fear pretending to be science. By anxious men terrified that equality would mean the end of everything they knew. And maybe, just maybe, the end of them being in charge. Tonight, as you sink into your pillow, free from starched collars and racial hierarchies disguised as academic disciplines, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Sleep well, knowing that the truth is stronger than fear, and that real reason, doesn't need a tape measure or a superiority complex to make its point. It just needs time, compassion, and the courage to say, we got that very, very wrong. In the late 19th century, scientists treated human skulls like Pokemon cards, collecting, trading, and categorizing them with the enthusiasm of over-caffeinated grave robbers. Entire expeditions set out, not for gold or glory, but for craniums, the skulls of indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and colonized populations were shipped by the hundreds to London, labeled specimens, and stacked in wooden drawers beside tea sets and beetle collections. You'd think someone might have paused and said, "Hey, this feels weird." They didn't, because nothing says scientific progress quite like turning someone's ancestors into data points. You wake up in a Victorian university lab, surrounded by wooden drawers, brass instruments, and the unmistakable smell of formaldehyde and entitlement. Each drawer opens to reveal a neatly labeled skull. Zulu male, approx. 30. Aboriginal female, unknown age, Irish criminal, hanged 1849. The labels are written in looping cursive, as though the ink could somehow make the theft feel polite. This is phrenology's final form, the commodification of human remains under the banner of research. No longer content to just measure living people's noses and draw sweeping conclusions, Victorian scientists decided they needed to study the dead, preferably those who couldn't say no. The thinking was disturbingly straightforward. If you want to understand the hierarchy of humanity, you'd better have a few thousand skulls lying around to prove it. And so, the skull trade was born. It was global, brisk, and horrifying. Anthropologists, collectors, missionaries, and even military officers participated, digging up graves, raiding battlefields, or acquiring the remains of recently deceased colonized individuals was seen as an unfortunate but necessary side quest for science. Ship manifests from this time read like something out of a gothic horror novel: tea, textiles, gunpowder, and 6 boxes of assorted skulls. The British Museum, the Royal College of Surgeons, and various university anatomy departments competed to grow the largest collections. Skulls were sorted, catalogued, measured with endless precision, and ranked according to the theories of the day. A longer cranium, more civilized; a broader jaw, animalistic; a smaller brain case, naturally inferior. Never mind the glaring inconsistencies. If a skull supported the empire's ideas, it was celebrated. If it didn't, it was dismissed as anomalous. And this wasn't just fringe science, it was mainstream. Eminent professors gave lectures to packed halls, showcasing skulls as if they were trophies. They'd hold one up and say, "Behold, the cranium of a Papuan, noticeably lacking in moral architecture," while sipping tea and receiving polite applause. It was anthropology as theatre, complete with props and a total absence of consent. Meanwhile, back in the colonies, local communities were understandably horrified. Graves were desecrated, ancestors stolen, and remains shipped off to cold European shelves. Some protested, some begged for the return of their people. Most were ignored. After all, in Victorian science, if you weren't wearing trousers and speaking English, your opinion didn't count. There were occasional critics, individuals who whispered that maybe grave robbing for research was a step too far. A few even argued that collecting skulls without consent might be, at best, unethical and, at worst, a deeply creepy hobby. but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of prestige, funding, and imperial pride. Over time, the scientific community moved on from skull measurements to newer forms of pseudoscience, leaving behind tens of thousands of human remains, boxed and forgotten in dusty storerooms. Some are still there today, waiting, unceremoniously catalogued and wholly misunderstood. So tonight, as you lie comfortably in your bed with all your bones where they belong, reflect on the deeply strange moment in history when knowledge meant collecting heads. The Victorians measured, ranked, and sorted human lives into drawers, but what they really exposed wasn't racial truth. It was their own obsessive need to control, quantify, and possess what they didn't understand. Sleep well and maybe lock your drawers, just in case. Victorian thinkers loved ranking not just races, but personalities. Industrious races were, conveniently, themselves. Lazy races, on the other hand, were anyone living in a climate warmer than England's damp misery. Whole theories emerged about how tropical sunshine made people unambitious. It couldn't possibly be because colonial powers had stolen their resources and forced unpaid labor, right? Nope, must be the weather. Victorian scientists essentially invented the world's most pretentious weather report. High humidity, low productivity, rampant racism. You find yourself in a lecture hall, somewhere between a mahogany desk and a very sweaty chalkboard, listening to a gentleman with a receding hairline and far too much confidence explain that Africans are naturally indolent because of the torpor of the tropics. Meanwhile, he's sweating through 3 layers of wool, clearly out of breath, and has never worked a physical job in his life. But his thermometer is very precise, and so his conclusions must be too. This was the golden age of climate determinism, the idea that the weather not only affects your mood but defines your civilization. Hot, sunny climates were believed to lull people into laziness. Cold, grey climates, like jolly old England, apparently fostered innovation, moral rigour, and the noble art of queuing. Entire continents were labelled unproductive based on rainfall patterns and average UV index. Victorian scientists, many of whom had never left the British Isles, wrote entire essays explaining that people in tropical zones were too relaxed, too prone to leisure, too unwilling to build factories or destroy their own environment in the name of progress. It couldn't possibly be that colonized populations had been stripped of autonomy, wealth, and resources. No, it was definitely the coconut trees. Even the concept of work ethic was racialized. Europeans were described as having a natural drive to improve, to toil, to conquer the land. Everyone else? Described as idle, dreamy, or childlike. And if they did work hard, say as enslaved labourers or indentured servants, then it was argued that they were only physically capable, not mentally competent. In the Victorian brain, this was all perfectly logical. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to explain away exploitation. The real irony? Victorian aristocrats did very little actual work. Most of their day involved giving instructions to servants, attending dull functions, and adjusting their cravat. Their idea of industry was managing investments and judging who had the proper boots for the opera. Yet they were the ones declaring others lazy, particularly those they had just colonized, enslaved, or overtaxed into generational poverty. Climate theories also became a convenient excuse for empire. We must rule them, they'd say. For the heat has made them too idle to govern themselves. And so came the missionaries, administrators, and civil servants, armed with fans, quinine, and an overwhelming sense of moral superiority. Entire colonial policies were crafted around the idea that non-Europeans lacked discipline and therefore needed supervision. To make things worse, this nonsense wasn't confined to academia. It seeped into newspapers, novels, and school books. Children grew up believing that hot countries were full of people who napped instead of worked, who danced instead of planned, and who needed British guidance to get anything done. The stereotype of the lazy native became both policy and punchline. But here's the thing the Victorians didn't want to admit. You don't build civilizations, irrigate deserts, navigate oceans, or resist empires for centuries by being lazy. The people they labeled as idle were often working harder, surviving harsher conditions, and carrying more weight, literally and metaphorically, than their conquerors ever would. So as you drift off tonight, remember, laziness is often just a projection by people who don't want to admit they've benefited from stolen labor. The next time someone blames sunshine for societal structure, feel free to offer them a history book, a glass of water, and a nap they clearly need. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of both humidity and hypocrisy. Picture it. A man in khaki, compass in hand, declaring himself the discoverer of people who have been living there for 10,000 years. Victorian explorers doubled as scientists, bringing back sketches, bones, and deeply condescending diary entries. They saw themselves as heroes of knowledge, bravely mapping uncharted lands. Never mind the actual maps drawn by locals centuries prior. Their reports combined geography, gossip, and guesswork into best-selling adventure novels that convinced Europe the rest of the world was waiting to be civilized. You open your eyes in the middle of a steamy jungle. A pale, overdressed man with a waxed moustache is holding a telescope backward and loudly announcing that he's discovered an entirely new people, as those very people sit 10 feet away, unimpressed and boiling cassava. This is the Victorian explorer scientist in his natural habitat, misidentifying birds, renaming mountains that already had names, and confidently drawing borders with zero local input. In the 19th century, science and exploration weren't two separate jobs, they were a package deal. An explorer wasn't just a traveler. He was a cartographer, a botanist, an anthropologist, a self-declared ethnographer, and, occasionally, a very bad zoologist. Armed with a sketchbook, a few Latin phrases, and an enormous sense of destiny, he set out to study people and places he believed were lucky to be studied. Victorian explorer scientists didn't just chart rivers, they charted cultures, assigning value as they went. Tribes were categorized as warlike or childlike. Customs were labeled primitive or picturesque. Languages were reduced to curious sounds, and complex social systems were dismissed as rudimentary. All of this, of course, was written up in elegant prose that made the explorer look brave, brilliant, and just colonial enough to get a book deal. And those book deals? Oh, they were gold. Readers back in London devoured tales of cannibal tribes, lost cities, and noble savages. They weren't reading science, they were reading adventure fiction disguised as academic observation. Explorer scientists became celebrities. They gave lectures, wore exotic jewelry as conversation starters, and wrote memoirs with titles like Through the Heart of Darkness with Only a Journal and My Moral Compass. Their discoveries were sometimes real. Plants, animals, rock formations. But the interpretation of people was always skewed. Locals were seen as obstacles, specimens, or side characters in the explorer's heroic narrative. If a village had irrigation, it was accidental genius. If a tribe had laws, it was surprising sophistication. If a kingdom had roads, palaces, and tax collectors, well, it was promptly ignored in favor of finding someone less inconveniently accomplished. And of course, they brought things back. Artifacts, skeletons, sacred objects, and sometimes entire people. Museums filled up with items labeled collected, rarely mentioning how many were actually looted or acquired through force, deceit, or vague promises of scientific interest. No, one asked the original owners. They just shipped it all home, boxed it up, and called it curated knowledge. The cult of the explorer scientist gave Victorian Britain what it craved, the illusion that the world was still full of blank spaces waiting for British names. It fed the belief that knowledge flowed one way, outward from Europe, downward onto everyone else. And it masked conquest as curiosity. So as you slip into sleep tonight, think of all those dusty volumes, all those pompous diaries, all those travelogues dripping with heatstroke and hubris. Remember that discovery often means we finally noticed what someone else already knew. And real exploration doesn't require conquest, just the humility to ask questions, listen to the answers, and maybe leave the bones where you found them. Sleep well, explorer. May your dreams be guided by maps not drawn in ignorance and boots that don't trample someone else's home. If you ever wondered what happened before cable television, it was this. In Victorian Britain, scientific lectures were all the rage, half education, half theatre, entirely nonsense. Crowds packed halls to hear mustached men talk about racial hierarchies using diagrams that looked like bad art projects. Some even brought live specimens on stage. Humans from colonized regions, made to stand still while professors gestured dramatically about evolutionary differences. Imagine TED Talks, but racist and with worse lighting. You take a seat on a creaky wooden bench in a crowded lecture hall. The air smells like damp wool and intellectual overconfidence. On stage, a man in a velvet waistcoat holds a pointer and stands beside an easel with what appears to be yes. That's definitely a papier-mâché skull glued to a triangle. The crowd hushes. The gas lamps flicker. It's time for another evening of the Enlightenment, but make it gross. These lectures were wildly popular, essentially the Netflix specials of their time. People came to gawk, not to learn. Scientific evenings blended infotainment with a hint of circus. And no one saw a conflict between inquiry and performance. Professors with elaborate beards explained the differences between races with the confidence of someone who had never questioned their own reflection. Their evidence? A few calipers, some oil paintings, and a tendency to pronounce data like it came from Mount Olympus. This wasn't limited to dusty universities. These shows toured music halls and civic centers. Posters advertised them like magic acts. See the skull of a native. Discover why your nose shape proves you're more evolved. Parents brought children, ladies brought notebooks, gentlemen brought egos. Everyone brought the assumption that they were at the top of whatever chart would be shown next. And the charts. Oh, the charts. Pyramids of human development, with white Europeans perched comfortably at the peak, surrounded by laurel wreaths and flowing drapery. Below them, a descending staircase of racial caricatures, each one drawn with less effort and more malice. These weren't just diagrams. They were Victorian vision boards of superiority, pasted together with bad anthropology and worse intentions. What made it worse, what made it truly horrifying, was the use of real people as part of the spectacle. Ethnological exhibits featured individuals from colonized regions brought on stage to stand silently while professors explained their supposed physical and mental shortcomings. These people were often forced into traditional dress, posed stiffly, and labeled with pseudoscientific jargon that stripped them of dignity, agency, and even their names. One night, you might see a young woman from South Africa paraded on stage as an example of exotic physiology. Another evening, a man from New Zealand is asked to smile so the audience can examine the curvature of his teeth. It was human zoo meets PowerPoint presentation, except the PowerPoint was hand-drawn and dripping with racist conjecture. The audience rarely questioned it. Why would they? The lectures confirmed everything they already believed. That they were smart, moral, destined to rule, that their civilization was the most advanced because a man with a degree and a chalkboard said so. The theatre of science became the cathedral of empire, where faith in one's superiority could be reaffirmed, weekly, for the price of a ticket. But beneath the applause and the ridiculous diagrams, there were cracks. A few brave souls stood up to the spectacle. They wrote rebuttals. They questioned the methodology. Some even demanded an end to live displays. But in a room full of applause, the truth has to shout to be heard. And often, no one wanted to listen. So tonight, as you dim the lights and settle in, remember that not everything presented as science is rooted in truth. Sometimes it's just fear, dressed up in academic robes, waving a pointer and performing for a crowd. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of chalk dust, bad lighting, and deeply misinformed lectures. By the time the 20th century arrived, Victorian science had already poisoned politics, education, and medicine. The polished language of data and progress made the lies sound trustworthy. Those skull charts and skin color hierarchies didn't just disappear, they morphed into early eugenics programs, immigration policies, and intelligence tests designed to prove what bigots already believed. The legacy of Victorian pseudoscience wasn't dusty museums. It was systems still echoing today, all born from an era that confused measurement with meaning and bias with truth. You'd think the madness would have burned out with the gas lamps. But no, the nonsense put on a lab coat, sharpened its pencils, and marched straight into the 20th century. The skull measurers became the policymakers. The phrenologists grew up, shaved their sideburns, and started running institutions. Victorian pseudoscience hadn't died, it had evolved. Eugenics, the ugly offspring of these old ideas, took the stage next. It sounded modern, even humanitarian. Who wouldn't want to improve the human race? But the translation of that phrase was chilling. Sterilize the unfit, segregate the inferior, and reward the better stock. The same measurements that once ranked skulls in dusty lecture halls were now determining who could marry, who could reproduce, and who could exist peacefully. This was science stripped of humanity, wrapped in spreadsheets, and weaponized with government funding. In Britain, America, and across Europe, eugenics societies popped up like bad ideas with grant money. They held conferences with charts and graphs that looked eerily familiar. Those same tidy pyramids of fitness recycled from the Victorian era, just updated with new fonts. Politicians quoted these findings in Parliament and Congress, convinced that progress meant pruning humanity like an overgrown hedge. The tests came next, intelligence tests, supposedly neutral, mathematically precise, designed to measure innate ability. In practice, they measured poverty, education access, and cultural familiarity with the test writer's world. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were given exams in English, often after days without sleep, and their scores determined their worth. Low intelligence, the headlines declared. Proof that some races were naturally inferior. No one stopped to consider that the questions about opera, geometry, and word puzzles weren't universal truths, they were cultural traps. And it didn't stop there. Medical research carried the same rot forward. Doctors assumed racial differences in pain tolerance or disease resistance, ideas straight out of Victorian anthropology, were real. Black patients received less anesthesia, fewer diagnoses, and worse care. Scientific objectivity had inherited the Victorian gaze. Detached, confident, and catastrophically wrong. Even popular culture drank from this poisoned well. Textbooks taught that civilization spread outward from Europe like light from a candle. Children learned that some peoples were advanced, while others were developing. Museum exhibits displayed looted skulls and artifacts as educational. The tone was calm, reasonable, factual, and that was the danger. Respectable nonsense sounds so much like truth when spoken in the language of authority. But slowly, cracks began to show. A new generation of scientists, many from the very groups once labeled inferior, began dismantling the myth. Anthropologists like Franz Boas and geneticists like JBS Haldane debunked racial hierarchies with data that actually made sense. The Human Genome Project, decades later, would finish the job, proving that race is not biological, but a social illusion drawn from centuries of bad measurement and worse motives. Still, the ghost lingers. You can hear it in arguments about IQ, in health disparities, in beauty standards shaped by empire. The Victorians may be gone, but their equations still echo in systems built on their assumptions. So tonight, as you lie under your blanket, no calipers, no hierarchies, just human, remember this. The true mark of progress isn't how well we measure people. It's how willing we are to stop. Sleep well, knowing that real science, like real humanity, begins not with superiority, but with humility. So tonight, as you lie back in your clean bed, with your temperature-controlled air, your Wi-Fi, and your complete lack of skull-measuring acquaintances, take a slow breath. Let the absurdity of Victorian science fade into the background hum of your fan. Those men in wool suits and confidence didn't just get things wrong, they weaponized wrongness. They built entire systems of inequality out of rulers, tea, and Latin words that sounded smarter than they were. And somehow, it all made sense to them. But here's the strange comfort in that. History is a mirror, not a verdict. Every era thinks it's the smartest one in the place room. Every society has its blind spots, its bad science, its certainty that it's on the right side of progress. The Victorians had phrenology, we have social media algorithms. Both involve questionable data, and far too many men explaining things no one asked about. Still, it's worth remembering the people who pushed back. The scientists, writers, and thinkers who called nonsense by its name. They were the quiet voices saying, maybe measuring skulls isn't enlightenment. They remind us that progress doesn't come from the loudest people in the room. It comes from those willing to say, wait, are we sure about this? So as you drift off tonight, maybe whisper a small thank you to curiosity, to humility, to the comforting fact that human stupidity, while vast, is at least historically consistent. The Victorians tried to prove superiority with calipers. You just need a good night's sleep and maybe a reminder that knowing better is its own kind of evolution. Close your eyes. Let the fog of London fade away. Let the coal smoke clear. And rest easy, knowing that even in history's most misguided moments, humanity keeps inching forward, awkwardly, arrogantly, but forward all the same.